If you aren't terminally online, like the kind of person that my wife is, it may surprise you that there has been a wellspring of people not only justifying the horrific murder of Charlie Kirk, but actually celebrating it. And I'm not just talking about random anonymous trolls and basement dwellers, I'm talking about prominent, respectable people who have something to lose. Like, back in my day, villainous people at least knew how to act, so as to convince decent people that they could be trusted. But it seems like in the past decade or so, the masks have been slipping off and people have become so vicious that they can't even keep the facade erect, even when it's in their own self-interest. So, for example, Stephen King, one of the most high-profile authors in the world, when he found out about Charlie Kirk's death, he immediately posted on Twitter that Charlie had advocated for the stoning of gay people, implying therefore his death was a good thing, which is of course not true. Kirk never said anything even close to approximating that. But King obviously heard that somewhere and was so eager to believe it that he didn't bother checking if it was true or not. And out of that laziness and I would say malice, he felt entitled to the conclusion that Charlie Kirk deserved to be murdered. Popular streamer Destiny said that he wouldn't condemn the killing and said that conservatives should be afraid of getting killed when they go to events, unless they force Donald Trump to turn down the temperature, as if that's what he's doing. Musical performers Bobby Vylan dedicated a song at their concert to Charlie by calling him a piece of, well, vulgar word for malarkey, and then said that if you talk malarkey, you get banged, and then laughed and started jumping up and down in celebration. The incoming president of the Oxford Union, who met and debated Charlie in Oxford, allegedly posted in a chat, "Charlie Kirk got shot. Let's effing go." He also reportedly wrote "Charlie Kirk got shot, LOL" in another message on Instagram. Again, obviously in celebration. When asked to explain his reaction, he said that Kirk often dismissed or mocked the suffering of others, and that he made dehumanizing comments about LGBTQ members and Hamas, I suppose attempting to draw sympathy for his reaction. And in the immediate aftermath, there were countless videos and posts on platforms like TikTok of people dancing and celebrating and mocking Kirk and his family. In fact, it was so ubiquitous that someone started cataloging it in a database and claims to have over 50,000 entries as of the time I'm recording this of people celebrating Kirk's death. And while some people may not be surprised by all of this, I have to admit, I kind of am. I'd like to believe that regardless of your political beliefs or affiliation, enough people are animated by enough decency that this kind of thing would be rare and roundly condemned, yet it hasn't been rare. And people seem to be emboldened enough by their community, or I don't know if it's their environment or what, to think that it's a normal way to behave. It's honestly been a bit of a shocking revelation for me. And whenever I reflect on philosophies or the behaviors of others, I try to do whatever I can to see it, from their perspective, to try to put the shoe on the other foot, either out of a desire to arouse compassion or at the very least to try to understand their error from their perspective. So out of that desire, I asked myself two questions. One, what would it take for me to think that the gruesome assassination of someone in front of his wife and his small children, in front of a crowd of youth and college students, is a justifiable thing? And two, what would it take for me to not only think it was justified, but to actually celebrate it, to publicly laugh, dance, and to give people high fives? In other words, how bad would the person who was killed have to be for me to adopt either of those two sentiments or patterns of behavior? And then I also remembered that all of these people celebrating are obviously on the left. I haven't seen anyone on the right acting this way, which is a bit ironic considering, isn't it the left who much more consistently and enthusiastically promotes the abolition of the death penalty? So, okay, punishing mass murderers and child rapists with death is inexcusable, but punishing your political opposition with death is an occasion for revelry and celebration. Help me make sense of this, because that former category, like mass murderers and child abusers, that's the kind of threshold that someone would have to cross before I could feel like their death could be justified. If we're talking political figures, like someone committing unnecessary violence and oppression against an innocent population, yeah, okay, that's the degree of evil that would have to be perpetrated for me to think, you know what, maybe the world is better off without this person. And then to the second question, I don't know that I could easily celebrate and cheer anyone getting killed. It would have to be someone like a Hitler or a Stalin for me to stand up and cheer for their death. And I hope most decent people would agree with that. Which raises a glaring follow-up question. What does it say about the people, including celebrities and pundits and political leaders, and then everyday people like doctors and teachers and union leaders and whatever else who went on the record saying that Kirk fit that description for them, that he was so evil, that his death was excusable or even praiseworthy? It means they either thought that Charlie Kirk was in a category of moral values shared with mass murderers and child abusers, or that their moral compass is so egregiously distorted that the threshold of what justifies murderous violence for them is when people say things they disagree with, that their political orthodoxy has become so absolute that they are willing to start putting heretics to death. And again, these weren't losers in their parents' basement. These were teachers, union leaders, respectable professionals of all sorts announcing these horrid sentiments to the public, to the world. And the reason we know this is because the media is now covering this as a story, because people who saw their posts have been reporting it to their employers. And now the media is framing these people as victims of the mob. So we know they were people who had a reasonably respectable life and something to lose. Now, if what motivates this behavior and these reactions is the belief that Kirk was so reprehensible that the danger he posed was comparable to a convicted murderer or the kinds of political despots who murder by the thousands or even the millions, that raises a follow-up. How did they come to believe that he was so irredeemably and viciously evil himself? And unfortunately, I can think of a few reasons. How about the fact that every time someone with conservative beliefs gains traction with a movement because they published a book or they have a social media presence, the media then characterizes that person as far right. I've seen it in the headlines countless times. I don't consider myself far right, but I do find people online that I sympathize with, high-profile people, that I then see characterized by the media as far right. In other words, the media considers them to be something like a Nazi. And some are less subtle in this belief. Lots of people and outlets have outright called Kirk a Nazi or a fascist. And if that's true, if Kirk really was a Nazi, I can understand why they would think it was only a matter of time before he started promoting the genocidal solutions to the political problems that we face today. But of course, Charlie Kirk never said anything approaching that kind of extremism. In fact, there are plenty of clips of him responding to people confronting him, accusing him of being a fascist, with him explicitly and enthusiastically denying that he was one, and then explaining the differences between what he believes and what fascism promoted in its heyday, or to whatever degree it exists today. Charlie was outspoken about what his beliefs were, and they were far from extreme. They're the kind of values I was mostly raised with, even though my upbringing was entirely secular and sampled from the zeitgeist of the 90s and early 2000s. Charlie believed that governments should be limited and decentralized. That's not that crazy, even if you disagree with it. He believed that the family was the cornerstone of civilization. Pretty obvious. He was a Protestant Christian. He didn't think that men could become women or vice versa. He believed a whole range of ideas that are the kinds of things that you can find records of people like Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Hillary and Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless others agreeing with. But extremists on the left have been so diligent in working overtime and with some obvious success to move that Overton window so far in the other direction, with a special focus on especially indoctrinating kids with their beliefs, that what was previously common and moderate is now something they believe they can portray as extreme. So the only reason people could draw the conclusion that Kirk deserved what he got because he's as bad gets, something like a murderer, is because they've been deceived. They've been living under a spell of propaganda and then marinating in it for so long that they now find themselves excusing public, extrajudicial executions as something that is within the sphere of things that they're willing to tolerate, if not celebrate. I remember when Kim Jong-il died, the former communist dictator of North Korea and the father of the current communist dictator of North Korea. For days after he died, there were clips of North Koreans who were out in the streets, driven to dramatic, hysterical spectacles of grief and mourning. And I remember asking myself, like, what would it be like to be that indoctrinated, to be capable of such blind hysterics that reflect nothing of the reality of their situation. But then I ask myself, like, how do I know I'm not indoctrinated? How could I know? How could I even test that? And that's actually a disturbingly difficult question to answer, but at least I'm willing to ask it. I hope that people who would simultaneously vote for the abolition of the death penalty while also tolerating public assassinations of people they disagree with is the kind of thing that will rouse them out of this propaganda-induced inebriation that they're in. I hope it will help them realize that they have been deceived and that they need to disconnect from the sources of media or the internet or whatever it is that has been so effective in manipulating them that it's actually moved their moral perception to dangerous degrees on the compass without them even realizing it. And I hope now they do realize it and are willing to take steps to end that cycle of manipulation. If you're someone whose initial reaction was anything but horror at the news of Kirk's death, I hope you're willing to do some soul searching, and not merely because that's the direction of the moral high ground that decent people are traveling towards, or because you might get reported to your employer or anything like that, but merely because it's the right kind of reaction to have. It shows you're a decent human being with even just a sliver of compassion, which is all that it should take. And as disturbing as it is to consider, I think it might be worth reflecting on the implications of seemingly well-to-do people reacting the way that they have. Because if we're a community, if we're a nation, there has to be something that binds us together, something that builds trust between neighbors. But if you hold views like men and women are immutable categories of the human race, or that marriage is an institution based on the reproductive potential of men and women, or that large centralized governments are not the way to increase justice, or that basic liberties guaranteed in most Western constitutions or bills of rights should be protected and guaranteed, then apparently there are people, perhaps living next to you or even working next to you, that wouldn't object to you being murdered and might even celebrate it if it happened. That's an intolerable state of affairs, and it's a vivid depiction of the fact that moral and cultural relativism, this era of values, has failed undeniably, catastrophically. For us to be a cooperative community in any way at all, we have to possess some substantial shared beliefs and culture. We can't allow profiteers and politicians to continue to divide us as they have for their own benefit, which they're most able to do in a culturally and morally relative atmosphere. Because if people living and working right next to you have become so intolerant of your otherwise perfectly reasonable beliefs that they wouldn't blink if someone shot you in the neck for it, then we have to admit that there's nothing left to salvage here. The fabric of society that binds us as neighbors is completely torn in that case. And like I said in my last video, I don't think there's a political solution here. I think the only solution comes through faith in God and his son. Because when the tone of antagonism reaches this level of hostility, Christianity is the only voice out there that says, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. It's the only demographic, the only community who will find a reason not to resort to all-out civil war. And remember, these divisions and this untenable degree of polarization wouldn't be possible without social media and mainstream media. Two business models that are, at the end of the day, motivated by for-profit interests. They're willing to do anything in the service of those interests, including sensationalizing information that only leads to severe hostility and division. Which is why, for my part, except out of curiosity for what people are actually thinking and being persuaded by, I otherwise don't watch mainstream media. I place serious limits on my usage of social media as well. I have no social media apps on my phone. And when I'm at home with my family, it's basically a rule that we aren't allowed to just pick up our phones and get lost in that matrix of voluntary slavery. Instead, I spend time reading books, visiting with my wife and kids, going for a run, indulging in hobbies. In fact, often when I'm out for a run and I can see right into people's front windows, all I see are screens, giant screens with the 24-hour propaganda cycle. And I know that my lifestyle might seem strange and novel to many people, but you know what's even more strange? Being so desensitized to hate and propaganda that you don't think twice about laughing about someone getting murdered on the internet. I think that's strange behavior, and the lifestyle that leads to it is probably not the kind that any of us should be tolerating anymore. I hope that the horror of this episode is enough to convince you that the kind of lifestyle I admire and aim to lead, the kind that might have been considered eccentric and unnecessary 5 to 10 years ago, can now be seen as the only antidote to a world that has completely lost its mind and its moral direction. I know that, for my part, it's only convinced me to double down and retreat even further from allowing insidious influences to bend my ear and my mind. Okay, thanks for watching that. I hope that was a blessing to you, that it encouraged you and edified you in your journey with the Lord. And if it did, and if you want to support the work that we're doing as a result, which thank you so much for considering that, because we really do need your help to make this viable. Then there's a few ways you can do that. You can go to brianholdsworth.ca/help, which is obviously my website. And there's some options there. One is to just contribute through my website. The other would be to join us over on Locals, where you can interact with me and other like-minded people. You can gain access to exclusive content where we're doing live streams and I'm uploading videos and things like that. But we're also doing a secret philosophy study with a secret philosopher academic who's joining us once a month to take us through difficult texts that we want to read on our own, but we need some clarification and some guidance on that. So right now we're working through some works by St. Thomas Aquinas with him, and he's a Thomistic philosopher. So if that's interesting to you, join me on brianholdsworth.locals.com. And again, you can check out my website at brianholdsworth.ca/help.